At the southern end of South America, the land opens and thins. Patagonia stretches across Argentina and Chile, defined less by borders than by distance. The Andes run like a spine along its western edge, breaking weather systems and casting long-range shadows. To the east, plains flatten into steppe. Wind moves across them without interruption. The climate is cold but not uniform. Coastal areas feel the influence of the Southern Ocean. Inland regions remain dry, exposed, and spare. Temperatures change quickly. Snow can arrive without warning, even outside winter months. The light is sharp. Sound carries far, then disappears. Human presence is thin. Roads run for hundreds of kilometers without towns. Communication depends on weather and infrastructure that can fail quietly. In many areas, there is no shelter beyond what is built or carried. The land does not provide margin. It offers space, water in certain seasons, and animals adapted to scarcity. For centuries, this region has been described as empty. It is not. It is occupied by scale. Distance defines movement. Time slows in ways that are measurable only after days have passed. Patagonia does not resist human entry. It simply does not respond. This is where the story begins. Not with an emergency, or a decision, but with a landscape that remains unchanged by intention. People enter it under ordinary circumstances. The conditions are already set. Long before maps fixed its outline, Patagonia was inhabited. Archaeological evidence places human presence in the region more than 10,000 years ago. Groups such as the Tehuelche and the Selknam lived across the plains and the southern archipelagos. Their movements followed seasons rather than borders. Shelter was temporary. Tools were light. Knowledge was carried through observation and repetition. Survival depended on reading weather, animal behavior, and terrain with precision. European awareness of the region began in the early 16th century. In 1520, Ferdinand Magellan sailed through the strait that would later bear his name. Accounts from that voyage described cold, wind, and distance. They also described people, tall figures seen from ships, interpreted through unfamiliarity. These early reports framed Patagonia as remote and severe, a place to be crossed rather than settled. Permanent colonial presence developed slowly. Spanish influence remained limited for centuries, constrained by supply lines and priorities elsewhere. It was not until the 19th century that Argentina and Chile moved decisively to assert control over the region. Military campaigns, land grants, and new borders followed. Indigenous populations were displaced, reduced, or absorbed under force. Written records from this period are uneven. Much knowledge was lost. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, new groups arrived with different intentions. Sheep ranchers established estancias across the steppe. European immigrants, Welsh, Italian, Croatian, German, brought agricultural practices adapted to other climates. Some succeeded. Many did not. Wind erosion, poor soil, and isolation limited expansion. Explorers and scientists followed. Naturalists documented glaciers, fossils, and unique species. Surveyors mapped rivers and mountain passes. Later, climbers and trekkers came seeking difficulty itself. They prepared with equipment and training, but preparation had limits. Patagonia remained unpredictable. Across these centuries, the motivation to go south varied. Economic opportunity. Scientific curiosity. National ambition. Personal challenge. Few arrived expecting catastrophe. Most entered the region under structured plans, relying on ships, horses, or later, vehicles. Survival was not the objective. It was an assumption. The landscape did not adjust to these assumptions. It remained consistent in its scale and indifference. Those who stayed learned routines shaped by restraint. Those who passed through often underestimated duration and distance. The difference mattered. For those entering Patagonia, the moment of separation rarely arrived as a single event. It emerged gradually, often unnoticed at first. A delayed supply ship. A river swollen beyond its usual banks. Winds strong enough to prevent travel for days. These were not disasters in isolation. They became decisive only when combined. Weather was the most consistent factor. The westerlies that circle the Southern Ocean meet the Andes with force. Storm systems stall and rebuild. Snow accumulates at higher elevations while rain saturates lower ground. Visibility can collapse without warning. In the early records of expeditions and settlements, days lost to weather were common. Plans accounted for some delay. They could not account for all of it. Geography narrowed options. Mountain passes were limited. Rivers ran fast and cold, fed by glacial melt. The coastline, broken by fjords and channels, offered few safe anchorages. Inland routes crossed open steppe where landmarks repeated and distances were difficult to judge. Once a route was blocked, alternatives were rarely close. Logistical failure often followed. Horses weakened or were lost. Fuel ran out sooner than expected. Equipment degraded in cold and moisture. Communication, when it existed at all, depended on schedules rather than contact. A missed rendezvous did not trigger immediate concern. Weeks could pass before absence was noted. Historical accounts show that the point of no return was rarely dramatic. There was no clear line crossed. Instead, movement slowed. Decisions became constrained. Turning back required resources equal to those needed to continue. Waiting became the default response, even when waiting carried risk. For some, isolation became complete when travel was no longer possible in any direction. Snow closed passes. Wind grounded vessels. Rivers rose and did not recede. The distance to assistance remained the same, but time began to work against them. Food supplies shortened. Physical condition declined incrementally. At this stage, survival shifted from planning to endurance. The landscape had not changed. The individual circumstances had. Patagonia did not present a crisis. It removed exits. Once movement slowed or stopped, survival in Patagonia depended on routine rather than reaction. Historical records from settlers, indigenous communities, and stranded expeditions show a consistent pattern. Those who endured did so by reducing variability. Days were structured to match the limits imposed by weather, light, and available resources. Shelter was the first priority. In the open steppe, this often meant adapting what already existed. Sheep ranchers used low structures built of stone, sod, or timber hauled from distant valleys. These buildings were not warm by design. They were wind-resistant. Openings were minimized. Fireplaces were small and efficient, fed by scarce fuel, often dried shrubs or animal dung when wood was unavailable. Among indigenous groups, shelters were lighter and temporary, positioned to take advantage of terrain features that broke the wind. Clothing followed the same logic. Layers were adjusted constantly. Wool, whether from sheep or guanaco, retained heat even when damp. Leather was used sparingly, as it stiffened in prolonged cold. Historical accounts note that wetness, more than low temperature, caused injury. Drying clothing became part of daily labor, timed to rare periods of reduced wind. Food acquisition required planning and restraint. On the steppe, sheep provided meat and fat, but herds could not be overused. Indigenous diets combined hunting with gathered plants and shellfish along coastal areas. Preservation mattered. Meat was dried or smoked when conditions allowed. Nothing was discarded. Caloric intake was monitored informally, adjusted to workload and season. Water was generally available, but access could be difficult. Streams froze or became inaccessible due to ice buildup. Snow was melted when necessary, a process that consumed fuel and time. Dehydration occurred even in cold environments, often unnoticed until weakness set in. Movement, when possible, was limited. Travel during storms increased risk without improving outcome. Many historical survivors recorded long periods of enforced stillness. During these times, maintenance replaced exploration. Tools were repaired. Footwear was patched repeatedly. Simple tasks were spread across the day to conserve energy and preserve morale, though the records describe this without psychological interpretation. Mental endurance was maintained through repetition and observation. Days were measured by light rather than clocks. Weather patterns were noted, not predicted. Expectations narrowed. Survival was not framed as temporary hardship but as a condition to be managed until circumstances changed. Adaptation occurred slowly. Those who lasted learned to accept delay without urgency. The environment did not reward speed or force. It favored consistency. In Patagonia, survival was not achieved by overcoming the land, but by aligning daily life closely enough to remain within its limits. Over time, the strain of sustained survival became visible. Historical accounts from ranch records, expedition logs, and recovery reports describe a gradual narrowing of physical capacity rather than sudden collapse. Weight loss was common. Minor injuries healed slowly or not at all. Cold-related conditions, frostbite, joint stiffness, chronic pain, accumulated quietly. Nutrition declined first in quality, then in quantity. Preserved meat lost fat content as supplies aged. Fresh sources became harder to access with seasonal change or exhaustion. Hunger was not always acute. It appeared instead as weakness, reduced concentration, and slower recovery after work. These changes were noted factually, without emphasis, in journals and administrative reports. Attempts to move or seek assistance often failed at this stage. Weather windows closed before travel could be completed. Animals used for transport weakened or were lost. Boats were damaged by wind or ice. Each failed effort reduced available resources and increased fatigue. After several attempts, records show that many stopped trying. Remaining in place became the least damaging option. Psychological pressure increased, though it was rarely described directly. Time lost definition. Days were recorded without detail, or not at all. Tasks were repeated because they were known, not because they improved conditions. Silence increased as physical energy declined. In group situations, individuals withdrew rather than conflicted. Deaths, when they occurred, were documented plainly. Causes included exposure, infection, accidents, and exhaustion. Burials were simple or delayed due to frozen ground. In some cases, bodies were moved later when conditions allowed. These events altered routines but did not end them. Survival continued in reduced form. The environment remained constant. Wind persisted. Temperatures fluctuated within expected ranges. The land did not become harsher. Human capacity diminished instead. What had once been manageable became effortful. What had been effortful became impossible. By this stage, outcomes were largely set. Recovery depended on external change, weather improvement, unexpected contact, or delayed rescue. Without that, decline continued at a measurable pace. Patagonia did not conclude the process. It allowed it to run. Resolution in Patagonia rarely arrived at a clear moment. When rescue occurred, it was often indirect. A delayed ship arrived on a later route. A patrol followed an absence rather than a signal. Another party encountered signs that had been left weeks or months earlier. Contact was administrative before it was human. Recovery records described survivors as weakened but stable. Movement was limited. Medical intervention, where available, addressed exposure and malnutrition rather than injury. There was no immediate return to normal condition. Transport out of the region took time and depended on weather in the same way survival had. Departure was slow and procedural. In cases where death was the outcome, confirmation came later. Remains were located during subsequent surveys or by chance. Official reports recorded dates as ranges rather than specifics. Causes were inferred from position, condition, and surrounding evidence. Uncertainty remained in many details. The process ended without conclusion beyond documentation. For those who lived, survival did not produce narrative closure. Many did not record their experiences in detail afterward. Some left the region permanently. Others returned to work under similar conditions. The event became part of a longer record rather than a defining episode. The land did not change at the moment of resolution. Weather continued. Distances remained. What ended was the period of isolation or endurance, replaced by transport, bureaucracy, and routine. Patagonia did not release those within it. It simply allowed transition when circumstances aligned. Patagonia's survival history is not defined by singular heroism or dramatic reversal. It is defined by duration. By the length of time people remained exposed to a landscape that did not register their presence. The region has accumulated records rather than legends, logs, reports, remains, and absences. What these accounts show is consistency. The same forces recur across centuries: wind, cold, distance, delay. Technology altered details but not structure. Motorized transport replaced horses. Radios replaced messengers. Yet isolation persisted when systems failed or time extended beyond planning. Survival here did not depend on conquest or resilience alone. It depended on restraint, alignment, and acceptance of limits. Those who endured did so by narrowing their lives to what could be maintained. Those who did not were often no less prepared. Patagonia remains largely unchanged by these outcomes. The land holds no record of success or failure. What remains is documentation, and the quiet understanding that survival at the end of the world is not an event. It is a condition, entered without ceremony and exited without announcement.